3. Interweaving. Having outlined the genesis and structure of Derrida's articulation of the plural logic of the a priori one and having demonstrated how this logic informs his reading of certain Freudian texts, I hope to have shifted the terrain of any Derrida /Lacan encounter beyond a prejudicial reading that sees difference as an endorsement of a merely textual free play, the uneconomic a priori. In part 3, I begin to shift my attention to the other side of the coin, so to speak. At this point, my broad aim is to gather further support for the claim that beyond the prejudicial readings on both sides, Lacanian psychoanalysis can be read most productively by viewing deconstruction not in adversarial terms but as another resource for decoding Lacan's theoretical formulations, for his infamous return to Freud already inscribes the complication that Derrida underscores in his reading of Freud, namely, the necessity and the impossibility of returning to either a positive doctrine or an entangled knot, neither of which is exactly their. Lacan's launchpad is certainly always Freud's text, but he returns to the ineradicable paradoxes, aporias, or dilemmas that rupture every Freudian concept, and his constant observation is that Freud left behind a legion of enigmas. 2. Moreover, one cannot argue that Lacan revisits these texts to resolve the enigmas and establish finally the kind of fundamental scientific concepts that bear faithful repetition. To the contrary, Lacanian psychoanalysis is an inventive appropriation that, in much the same spirit as Derrida's deconstructive reading, uncovers the auto-deconstructing tensions in Freud's text as a warrant for his radicalizations. 207. Here, I hope to show how one may counter Derrida's misreading of Lacanian discourse by sketching out 3 broad areas of interweaving, concerning the real, sexual difference, and feminine sexuality. In Chapter 7, I aim to demonstrate that there is a clear isomorphism between Derrida's formulations of difference and Lacan's formulations of the real. In fact, the Lacanian real functions as a nickname for difference, both understood in their proper complexity, of course. This isomorphism again shifts the terrain, but this time beyond Derrida's prejudicial reading that leaves Lacan in bed with the metaphysicians of presence. 3. By addressing the Lacanian real first, I diverge from the approach to commentary reflected in Sheridan's translator's note at the beginning of Lacan's Ecrits. Of these 3 terms, the imaginary was the first to appear. The notion of the symbolic came to the forefront in the Rome report. The real emerges as a 3rd term, for in my estimation, Lacan's conception of the traumatic real is intrinsic to his radical reinvention of psychoanalysis and remains the most important notion for interpreting his texts. In fact, I shall go so far as to claim that this notion forms the punctuation mark that retroactively gives the truth to his theoretical endeavor. 5. However, like Derrida's difference, it confers a strange kind of truth on his discourse, namely, the truth that truth is not a matter of truth ordinarily conceived, but the intrinsic inevitability of paradox. 6. Lacan's conception of the real, according to Sheridan, began, naturally enough, by presenting, in relation to symbolic substitutions and imaginary variations, a function of constancy. The real is that which always returns to the same place. 7. This statement by no means implies that Lacan promotes some version of naive realism. Instead, the real is another word for Freud's trauma and, as already explained, the happening of a trauma constantly remains, or repeats, in the sense that it can be neither ignored nor resolved through assimilation. If Lacan returns to Freud's realistic conception of the real, whose status is guaranteed by the repetition of the external object, it is to question this formulation via the means Freud himself provides for grasping reality as an economic fabrication that weaves the threads of an imaginary narrative around the ineradicable trauma. Lacan calls such reality the automaton. By contrast, to return to Sheridan, the Lacanian real becomes that before which the imaginary faltered, that over which the symbolic stumbles, that which is refractory, resistant. Hence the formula, the real is the impossible. 8. I shall approach Lacan's notion of the real as trauma, repetition and resistance, by reading the section of Seminar 11 entitled Tush and Automaton 9, which is a characteristically dense account of the paradoxes. 208 involved in Freud's notion of the real in the terms of the plural logic of the a priori. Lacan's distinction between automaton and tush turns on the contrast between reality, the economic a priori, and the impossible real, which is already an articulation of paradox. Notably, Lacan here bypasses the uneconomic a priori by dismissing out of hand the idea that psychoanalysis is a subjective idealism. Further, Lacan's text represents a choice for the paradoxical, the tush, as that which indicates the truth of the real. Notably, Lacan here gives a theoretical account of why inventive repetition, in Kierkegaard's sense of repeating forward, is the only possible repetition. 10. This alone is an indication that he understands his return to Freud, that is, his repetition of Freud, in terms of the same paradoxical notion of repetition that Derrida nicknames iterability. Finally, the Lacanian real, according to Sheridan, begins to appear regularly, as an adjective, to describe that which is lacking in the symbolic order, the ineliminable residue of all articulation, the foreclosed element, which may be approached, but never grasped, the umbilical cord of the symbolic 11. As Lee puts it, Lacan identifies the real as that which prevents one from saying the whole truth about it. Saying the whole truth is impossible not simply because words ultimately fail to reflect the multifaceted character of the real, but because the very fact of language has so ruptured the real that there is no whole to be described. 12. It is on the basis of this notion of rupture that Lacan introduces the aporetic trouble that Copy formulates in terms of the problem of the all and addresses in terms of the veil of alienation that articulates universalism and particularism, or, 1. Could say, economic and an economic difference. 13. Notably, then, it is through the figure of the real as trauma that one may gather together its incompatible senses, as repetition, resistance, and rupture, in a way that does not make utter nonsense of the notion but shows how the logical structure of the Lacanian discourse accords with the plural logic of the a priori. By the same token, a Lacanian account of sexual difference exemplifies the logic of difference, and it is again with a view to challenging misreadings on both sides and showing in what sense Derrida's analytical work can stand as a resource for grappling with Lacan's notoriously abstruse formulations that I have offered a detailed treatment of the Derridean conception of sexual difference that emerges from his deconstructive reading, in Gestschlicht of Heidegger's thinking on the subject. Chapter 8, broadly speaking, addresses a trouble that both Lacan and Derrida persistently grapple with, that of understanding difference in terms of binary oppositions. For many, sexual difference would seem to be the quintessential binary opposition, but there are, traditionally, 2 opposed views concerning what to make of it. Some thinkers argue that this binary is a fundamental, undeconstructable bottom line that one cannot get beyond. The opposing view is that this binary opposition is as deconstructible as any other and should give way to an unregulated proliferation of differences. The former is assumed to be the Lacanian position, but not, of course, by Lacanians. The second is supposed to be the Derridean, but, again, not by Derrideans. There is, in other words, mutual misrecognition on both sides of this equation. Contrary to the aforementioned reading, it seems clear enough that Lacan's infamous claim concerning the sexual relation, namely, that it does not exist, offers a deconstruction of any conception of sexual difference as binary. 14. Notably, I here intend deconstruction in the Derridian sense, rather than the sense given to this term by many misreadings. Many expositions testify to this interpretation. Fink, for example, argues that Lacan's claim is an attempt to subvert the dream of a harmony of opposites whose lineage can be traced back as far as Aristophanes' speech in Plato's Symposium, if not further, where he describes the symmetrical splitting asunder of originally spherical beings, and accounts for the origin of love in the desire to make good the loss in an emotional and physical bond with the missing complement, the other half. 15. Such subversion is implicit in Lacan's claim that love is impotent, though mutual, because it is not aware that it is but the desire to be one, which leads us to the impossibility of establishing the relationship between them two. 16. Evans confirms this view, arguing that among the many points condensed in Lacan's aphorism is the claim that there is no reciprocity or symmetry between the male and female positions because the symbolic order is fundamentally asymmetrical. 17. On Zedeki's account, which I shall address in more detail in due course, the binary conception of sexual difference, or, that is, the imposition of a balanced symbolic structure, is an attempt to heal the wound of sexual difference taken as the antagonistic gap that divides asymmetrical, non-complementary forms of jouissance. 18. There was never any doubt that Derrida deconstructs binary oppositions. There should not be any doubt, moreover, that Derrida never undertakes a deconstruction in the name of a simple postmodern proliferation of differences, but rather in the name of an asymmetrical relation, indeed, an antagonistic gap, between different kinds of difference. By working through Geschlecht then, I aim to show that Derrida deconstructs the binary articulation of sexual difference in the name of understanding sexual difference as another nickname for difference, for which the traumatic real, as mentioned, is a nickname, as indeed are other names taken up from Zedeki's essay, the real of sexual difference 210, such as the terms antagonistic gap, empty signifier and zero institution. 19. Following on from this treatment of sexual difference, which sees it in terms of an asymmetrical relation between non-complementary kinds of jouissance, I turn, in Chapter 9, to the question of why both Derrida and Lacan persist in labeling these kinds of jouissance feminine and masculine when both explicitly argue that these are by no means biological categories but structurally or logically ordered libidinal styles, both of which can be adopted by biological women and men. As Fink puts it, it should be recalled that sexuation is not biological sex. What Lacan calls masculine structure and feminine structure do not have to do with one's biological organs but rather with the kind of jouissance that one is able to obtain. 20. Here, I agree with Fink that there is no necessity attached to the masculine and feminine designations. One could just as well, for example, name these libidinal styles paranoid and hysterical, economic and uneconomic, and so on. 21. As I hope to demonstrate, however, in addressing Derrida's deconstructive reading of Nietzsche on the question of women and truth, in Spurs, there are nevertheless good political reasons, given the still ubiquitous dominance of patriarchy, to retain these sex-specific designations. Notably, Derrida's reading of Nietzsche allows a conception of feminine sexuality to emerge that is quite consonant with what is to be found on this topic in Lacanian discourse. 22. Lacan's isomorphic treatment of feminine sexuality will be addressed in greater detail in Part 4, where I shall argue that Lacan's theorization of the transcendental relation, based on these asymmetrical libidinal styles, again accords with the plural logic of the aporia.